The funeral of Queen Elizabeth has reflected traditions passed down by generations of the royal family. Joining us live is historian and senior lecturer at Sydney University, Dr Cindy McCreery. Thanks very much for your time. A lot of tradition passed on, but this was actually the first monarch funeral at Westminster Abbey since, the 18th century. Why that anomaly?
That's right, Tom. The last royal funeral of a monarch in Westminster Abbey, as you say, was in 1760 for King George II. And I think the main reason that Queen Elizabeth's funeral, or I should say the first part of her ceremony, because as you know, there was another ceremony, two ceremonies at St George's Chapel, Windsor later, where she was actually buried. But the main state funeral, which took place at Westminster Abbey, took place, I think, largely because of her global impact. This was a monarch that was not important just to people in the United Kingdom, to Commonwealth realms like Australia or other Commonwealth nations, but really to people around the world. And in order to accommodate that, they needed to find a venue that was large enough. And Westminster Abbey is much larger than St George's Chapel. And as we saw, 2,000 people were able to mourn the Queen at that service ahead of the smaller services at Windsor. So
many different elements to such an intricate, not just ceremony, but all the things leading up to it and afterwards as well. These are mainly traditions, aren't they? I mean, there's no requirement to do a lot of these things, but just traditions that have been around for hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years in total.
Tom, what's really interesting is that the Queen's funeral both showcases centuries-old traditions, as you say, but they also included new elements. And indeed, there were some many personal elements that the Queen herself, who of course was fully involved in the planning of her farewell, included. For example, the very, I think, memorable piping by her own piper. That was a new innovation that she wanted included in the funeral. So too, some of the hymns, such as The Lord is My Shepherd, was one of the Queen's favourite hymns. And as we know, Charles, the new king, insisted that the wreath on top of her coffin be a wreath that was including flowers and blooms from several royal residences, but also was a wreath that was environmentally sustainable, and there was no plastic involved in that. So it was, I think, a very touching and effective combination of old and new.
We know the ceremony itself, as you said, a strong flavour, obviously, of the Queen's faith in that. Do we know anything about the private elements? Because, of course, most funerals, particularly nowadays, there's a lot of personal anecdotes about that person. Did that sort of take place behind closed doors to the public?
Yes, I think it did, Tom. And as you say, the television cameras were not permitted in the third and final ceremonial aspect of the Queen's funeral, which was the actual burial of the Queen. And her coffin was moved to, along with the coffin of her former late husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, beside her own parents, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. That was a private service, and I think that was one where the royal family would have been able to unburden themselves and to express themselves more fully in private over the grief of their mother. But in fact, we already saw, I think, even at Westminster Abbey, the royal family coming together and expressing their unity in the face of grief. The very moving tribute that Charles laid on the coffin of his mother in Westminster Abbey, that simple card signed Charles R, Charles Rex. The fact that the royal family were seated together, I think that was a really important show of unity. The fact that George and Charlotte, the next generation, were shown very deliberately to the world to really confirm in everyone's eyes that there is a line of succession, that we know who will take the throne after the end of the current reign.
Yes, we know there's always that consideration within the palace, isn't there, that they do realise that they need to keep playing the game, if you like. Just finally, the actual role of, well, King Charles III now and the Queen as well. What's interesting is there are certain requirements. I mean, they do need to open Parliament, but since what's called the Glorious Revolution in the UK 300 years ago, it's a constitutional monarchy. They read out a speech on behalf of the Prime Minister in the same way the Governor-General here reads out a speech on behalf of the Prime Minister. And they're not having their own view, if you like. How much is just tradition that goes on? I mean, there's a weekly meeting between the monarch and the Prime Minister, but is that going to necessarily continue forever? This is just another tradition, isn't it?
Tom, you're right. The monarch in the United Kingdom is a constitutional monarch, no longer an absolute monarch. And it is absolutely essential, as we saw with the oath that Charles took, that accession oath, that he agrees to rule with Parliament. And that's absolutely essential. But that weekly meeting between the Prime Minister and the monarch is one that has become, I think, a very popular event. I think it's something that is people expect. And I see no reason why that wouldn't continue. And we know that Prime Minister Liz Truss has spoken already of her already very constructive relationship with King Charles. The two of them have a lot to grapple with. They're both new in their roles and they face huge challenges. And I think they understand it's in both their interests to be seen to be working together. So I very much think those meetings will continue on a weekly basis.
All right, Dr Cindy McCreery, thank you. We'll see how it all takes shape with King Charles III in that role now.